All right. Hopefully you can hear me. Um, so this assignment is going to be you finding an egg and then lighting it with one single direct light source and draw what you see. I recommend putting it on a light um, tabletop or take a piece of paper, put it underneath it. Um, and I did this. I want you to spend at least an hour on it. I literally did this like in 10 minutes. So you're not aiming for this level of rendering. You want something that has a lot more detail and a lot more sort of transitions and gradients. And in general, I think it helps to get more steps in between from your light, slowly step down to your shadow side. Um, this paper I'm using has more of a tooth to it, so you can see more of the grain. Um, Also, let me step back a few seconds here. Like, you also want to make sure you're using your full range of pencils. So, maybe you don't need your 6B, but you should have, at least your 2B, your HB. You could probably do this with your 2B and your HB only. And you're also going to want your kneaded eraser. Um, it's the gray eraser, and you literally knead it like a piece of dough. A lot of students keep it in the square, and then they use it like it's just a regular eraser. It's meant to be used a little differently. You can shape it any way you want. Like, let's say for instance you get like a blotch and you want to get rid of a very specific blotch. Like, um, I'll make a blotch. Let's say all of a sudden you get something like that and you don't like it. You can literally take this, knead it into a little point, and tap out that little blotch. I'm not really rubbing. I'm more tapping. And any kind of little, you can get those tiny microscopic little blotch, boop, 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 just by tapping it out. Or let's say you're doing your value scale. You can literally flatten this out. Let's say that was one of my value squares and it went too dark. You can just tap the whole thing and it'll lift up to a lighter value without having to, actually rub it. It's a handy tool when you're trying to get smooth gradients. So let me point some things out here. So, and you want to be careful about how you sort of get your edges. Like, for instance, the reason why I even see this edge is because the background is darker and then it shifts to a lighter. And then it's the reverse here. The background was lighter, but the egg was darker. So I lightly outlined this, but I'm not relying on line to resolve this. Um, this tends to be the problem with a lot of students, is they whenever we move on to the shading assignment, they're still relying on their line to define everything. So they're kind of doing like a coloring book kind of technique where everything is line and with a little bit of fill in. So they would do this, and they would maybe put in a little bit of shadow here, and then maybe fill in that shadow, and then maybe do a little smudging, and then they would let this line define that edge as opposed to having it be defined by a shift from value. Um, so I guess I want to say some more things about smudging. Like, I recommend not using your finger because your fingers tend to be oily and greasy. So you can use a paper towel. You can use, if you guys ever used a stump, you can smudge with a stump. So you can see when I shaded this shadow, the grain of the paper is letting a lot of white speckles in there. So if you push down into it, you can kind of get rid of the that grain a little bit. You can even come over here and smudge a little bit of this. Tempted to use my finger, but I won't. You can use. Sometimes I use a brush too to smooth an area. The point being, I'm just going to recommend you don't have to smudge, and if you do smudge, I'm just going to recommend don't use your greasy little finger. And I say that even if your hands are freshly cleaned, your skin always has oil in it, and it'll sort of leave blotches on the paper. So it's best to smudge something with something other than your fingers. So you can see you can kind of get a nice kind of transition going. This is nowhere near finished. This would take another 40 minutes to get it to the level of refinement that I want. Trying to think what else. So make sure you get a full range of values. Like, I'm not even near the level of darkness that this shadow needs to be. I have to come back in here and push down. And maybe that's slowly starting to approach it. And my advice in general is when you're shading, try to avoid doing this where you leave big, wide gaps, because then you have to try to come back and fill it in. It's best to figure out a way to shade where you're leaving the most minimal amount of gaps. And again, you notice the tip of this, I've sharpened it in a way where I have the whole side that I can use. So I'm not shading like this. I'm just using the needle point. So again, find an egg. And there's always a student who says that they don't have an egg because they don't like to eat eggs. Then find any kind of white ball that's smooth to draw, or go borrow an egg from your neighbor. Light it with one direct light source so you can see the light's coming from this direction. And yours are all going to be different. I would say, put a piece of white paper under it so it's white on white. Slowly build it up. And if you start outlining it, don't outline like this where it's heavy outline and you're having the outline do all the work for you. You want everything to be done with shifts and gradients, not just a coloring book outline. And spend a minimum of an hour on it. Use at least 3 or 4 different grades of your pencil. I even have something as hard as a 4H, which would be nice to do when it comes time to do those really, really pale gradients. It's hard to see, but there's literally like this tiniest little gradient happening with this one. I'm trying to think what else. Again, when you do your value scale, don't do the same thing. Don't outline. You're going to have to do some kind of line work, but make it really light so again the outline isn't separating the values. Here's another thing I'd recommend too. When you're shading your squares, I think it helps to go past the edge and just erase it, because students always do this. They fill it in and they kind of just slam on the brakes as they approach the edge. And they leave all these little white pockets in there, and then they come back and they try to fill it in, but they don't fill it in with the same pressure, so it's all blotchy. The goal is to get it to be consistent, and you can smudge that too, because again, if you want to work it into the grain. Sometimes what I do is I'll use that was a 2B. Sometimes I'll use a soft one, and then I'll get a hard one. This is my 4H, and I'll use that to sort of like refine it. It's kind of almost like using a rough sandpaper and then switching over to a finer sandpaper. I do this a lot. Even when I'm sketching, I'll start with a really soft pencil, and then I'll come back on top with a harder pencil. And so you got to do your value scale. Use your full range of pencils too. At a certain point, this is all wacky. At a certain point, you want to make sure you switch over. Like your really dark black one, you should probably be using your 6B, and then at a certain point switch over to like your 4B, your 2B, and then your HB, and then if you have a 2H for the really light ones over here. You don't want to be using, a lot of students, they'll just grab their 2H and they'll be using it to do the entire thing. You don't want to be pushing too hard. And then when it comes time to do your 6B, you want it to be literally as black as you can get it. So it is possible to push down as hard as you can and get it near black. It's never going to be black because this is graphite. It's just going to be a really, really, really dark gray. Hopefully that's helpful. Email me if you have any questions, and have it be full page. I would say life size or bigger for the egg, and then I'll write out specific instructions on how to do this, and I think that's it for now.